Welcome back to the US-250 podcast. Last time, we left off with Washington's defeat and retreat from Fort Necessity, followed by his resignation and shame. Until this point, the conflict had been resigned to colonial and native interests. Yet, in the aftermath of these events, things would begin to escalate. Britain decided it was time to step in. This was no longer just a Virginia affair. The next 2 years would prove to be a mixed bag of setbacks and gains for the interests of the British Crown and the colonies. Beginning in May 1755, British General Edward Braddock was tasked with taking a column of soldiers north to take Fort Duquesne, what is now Pittsburgh, and once and for all avenge Washington's defeat. This time the British would be moving with a force of 1,300 soldiers and another 800 men operating the supply trains. They would also build a road as they moved north to bolster the future supply trains after the conquest of the fort. This expedition was full of names of those who would later shape the future of the American Revolution. A young businessman from Pennsylvania named Benjamin Franklin was tasked with procuring provisions for the march, as well as two notable young men helping drive the supply wagons. One man was named Daniel Boone, of future frontier fame. The other, Daniel Morgan, was soon to be one of the most important generals of the American Revolution. He would later be responsible for the massive Patriot victory over Cornwallis and bloody Banastre Tarleton in the Battle of Cowpens. Amongst the British regulars were Thomas Gage. You'll recognize his name later as the commander who marched to Lexington and Concord to seize the weapons and powder of the colonials, thus instigating the shots heard around the world and starting the American Revolution. Also, amongst the officers of the expedition was Horatio Gates, who would later be heralded as the American patriot hero of the Battle of Saratoga. Also in attendance of this expedition, we witnessed the reappearance of George Washington. On the French side, Fort Duquesne was commanded by Claude-Pierre Picoty de Contrecoeur. His field commander was Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu. The garrison was composed of around 250 French Marines and Canadian militia, but the bulk of the force was provided by the native tribes allied with the French. 640 native warriors were representing the Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi tribes. Contrecoeur knew that with the forces and artillery that would be bearing down on him, defending the fort was not feasible. Instead, he decided to dispatch Beaujeu and his forces outside the force to face Braddock's oncoming column in battle and hopefully ambush it as it was crossing the Monongahela River, although this would not come to pass as the French didn't arrive to the river in time. Interestingly, the native forces in the fort who were not wholly confident with Contrecoeur's plan were showing few signs of willingness to leave the fort, and in a show of solidarity and to motivate the natives to join the operation, Beaujeu dressed in native attire and war paint for the attack to rally the forces. On July 9, 1755, 10 miles south of the fort, the opposing forces had happened upon each other almost by surprise. Thomas Gage was leading the column when the contact was made with the French opposition commanded by Beaujeu. Almost instantly, Beaujeu was shot dead. Yet this did not have the effect you would think. The French and native fighters maintained discipline and with sheer ferocity and bravery pushed Gage and his men back into a frenzied retreat. The fleeing soldiers slammed right into the rest of the British detachment arriving from behind to reinforce them. This broke down all organization and chaos ensued. Recognizing the chaos within the column, the French and allied native warriors enveloped them on the flanks and began to pick them off. What resulted was a complete massacre. During the chaos, General Braddock was mortally wounded and all looked lost for the British. However, it was at this moment that Colonel Washington was able to save what little was left of the column and organize a rearguard defense and retreat while protecting the supply wagons. 1,400 men entered the battle on the side of the British. Of those 1,400, 878 became casualties. Amongst the British officer corps, 73% casualties were suffered. The French and natives entered the battle with around 900 men, and they suffered 39 casualties. The Braddock expedition had ended in total disaster for the British. Although Braddock's column was defeated, simultaneously between the dates of June 19th and 30th, the British had invaded and were seeing a great deal of success to the north in Canada, taking Acadia, which we now recognize as the province of New Brunswick. In September of 1755, the fight shifted to New York, specifically around Lake George. The British moved north with their eyes on New France, which was modern-day Quebec. But to achieve this goal, they had to capture what was the defensive linchpin of the French north, Fort Saint-Frédéric, located on Lake Champlain. Leading the British forces was William Johnson, British agent to the Iroquois. He commanded a detachment of about 1,500 colonial troops and 200 native Mohawks. Leading the French was Baron de Dieskau. He commanded a force force of about 1,500 consisting of 200 French regular grenadiers, 600 Canadian militia, and 700 Abenaki and Caughnawaga Mohawk allies. Dieskau, knowing that Fort Saint-Frédéric stood as a desirable target, decided to put the odds in his favor by bringing the fight to the enemy. Dieskau moved his forces south to encamp in a position between Lake Champlain and Lake George. This site would be of great significance later in the American Revolution, becoming the building site for what would be known as Fort Ticonderoga. Dieskau from here would launch an attack on Johnson's current base of operations, Fort Edward. The two forces met in the field, in an ambush orchestrated by the French. Similar to the Braddock massacre, the French surprised the English, surrounding them on the flanks. This seemed like another huge French victory. However, unlike the defeat of Braddock, the fortunes of war began to turn in favor of the British. First, the rear of the British column was able to organize and put up a strong fight. Then Jacques Legardot de Saint-Pierre, a high-ranking French commander, and an allied native commander were both shot dead. Panic ensued, and the French suffered many casualties and a huge drop in morale as a result. This time, hearing the sounds of battle from afar, Fort Edward dispatched reinforcements to Johnson while Dieskau tried to rally his men for another attack. In the ensuing fight, the French suffered many more casualties, including Dieskau himself. The French had to abandon their attack and withdraw. The British collected the bodies that remained and threw them all into a pond, which to this day is named the Bloody Pond. In the aftermath of the fight, Johnson and his forces did not make it to Fort Saint-Frédéric. However, he was able to build a new fort at the southern tip of Lake George called Fort William Henry. The Battle of Lake George was the first major success for the British in the conflict, and after all these significant skirmishes, the British decided to officially declare war on the Empire of France on May 18, 1756. In early August 1757, the French decided to go back on the offensive in northern New York, this time under the command of the formidable Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. He marched south from Fort Carillon, which would later become Fort Ticonderoga, with a force of about 6,200 regulars and militia, along with 1,800 native warriors. They besieged Fort William Henry, and after 3 days, the British commander of the fort, Lieutenant Colonel Monroe, surrendered to the French. Montcalm's conditions for surrender were that the British abandon the fort, leave their ammunition, and retire south to Fort Edward under the protection of French forces. The native allies of the French were not satisfied with the nearly uneventful surrender. What would follow would become arguably the most notorious massacre of the war, and the setting for what would become a key event in James Fenimore Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans. As the British soldiers marched away from Fort William Henry, many of the Abenaki natives attacked. Montcalm and some of the French tried to intervene and stop this, but before much could be done, the British were enveloped and scattered. The native attackers took many goods, slaves, women and children, and scalps. The number of killed is up to historical argument, but it ranges from about 200 to 1,500. This bloody affair would not be forgotten by the British for the rest of the war. And that wraps up things for this episode. Between 1755 and 1757, we've seen many fights and massacres. It's been a mixed bag of massive defeats and small victories for the colonials and British, with the French coming on strong as both empires struggle for influence over North America. For this installment, we would recommend the novel The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, and also the 1992 movie of the same name starring Daniel Day-Lewis and directed by Michael Mann. See you next time.